The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each movement deliberate and calm despite the chaos brewing around her. The intelligence reports had been clear about the target location, but something felt wrong about this mission from the very beginning. Sarah had been part of the Navy SEALs for 8 years, one of only a handful of women to ever earn the coveted trident. She had proven herself countless times in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq, but today felt different. The weight of her teammates' stares pressed against her back as she took her position on the rooftop overlooking the suspected terrorist compound. "Ghost Actual, this is Viper 1. I have eyes on the target building," she whispered into her radio, using her call sign that had earned her respect among even the most skeptical male operators. Her ability to remain invisible and strike with deadly accuracy had saved countless lives over the years. Captain Mike Torres, the team leader, crackled back through the comm system. "Copy that, Viper 1. Hold position until we breach. Remember, this is a high-value target. We need him alive, if possible." Sarah scanned the compound through her scope, noting the unusual lack of movement. Most terrorist hideouts buzzed with activity, but this place seemed almost abandoned. Only 2 guards walked the perimeter, their movements lazy and unprofessional. Her training told her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that this was a trap. "Something's not right here," she murmured into her radio. "Too quiet. Recommend we abort and reassess." There was a long pause before Torres responded. "Negative, Viper 1. Intel is solid. We proceed as planned." Sarah had worked with Torres before, and while he was a capable leader, she had noticed subtle changes in his behavior toward her lately. The way he dismissed her tactical suggestions, the barely concealed eye rolls when she spoke during briefings, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She had faced discrimination before, but this felt more personal, more dangerous. As the team prepared to move in, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. 3 additional figures had appeared on adjacent rooftops, positioned in a way that would make her location completely exposed once the operation began. She was being set up, either by the enemy or by someone much closer to home. "Torres, I've got movement on the surrounding buildings. This is definitely a trap. We need to pull back now," she urged, her voice steady despite the growing dread in her stomach. "Negative. You're seeing ghosts, Chun. Stick to the plan and provide overwatch as ordered." The dismissive tone in his voice confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. This wasn't about completing the mission anymore. This was about removing a problem that some of her teammates felt threatened their traditional brotherhood. Sarah had overheard fragments of conversations, complaints about women weakening the teams, about her promotions being based on politics rather than merit. She had worked twice as hard as any of her male counterparts, scored higher on every test, and saved their lives more times than she could count. But none of that seemed to matter to the small group of operators who saw her as an outsider, a diversity hire who didn't belong in their elite world. As the breach began, Sarah maintained her position despite every alarm bell in her head telling her to move. She watched through her scope as Torres and the team approached the compound. The building erupted in gunfire, but not from where intelligence had indicated. The shots came from the rooftops she had identified, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped her teammates in the open courtyard. "Contact! Contact! We're pinned down." Torres's voice crackled with panic over the radio. Sarah immediately began engaging the enemy positions, her rifle barking as she picked off targets with methodical precision. One by one, she eliminated the threats from the surrounding buildings, watching as her teammates found cover and began their own counterattack. Despite being abandoned in an exposed position, she was doing exactly what a sniper was supposed to do, protecting her team. But as the firefight intensified, Sarah realized that the enemy positions had been perfectly arranged to target her rooftop. Every muzzle flash seemed aimed in her direction, and the concrete around her position began to disintegrate under sustained fire. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about their positions, someone who knew exactly where she would be stationed. "I need immediate extraction," she called into her radio. "Position is compromised and taking heavy fire." The response chilled her to the bone. "Negative, Viper 1. Hold position and continue mission." Torres was willing to sacrifice her to maintain the operation, or perhaps this had been his plan all along. Sarah had been investigating irregularities in mission reports, discrepancies in equipment inventories, and suspicious intelligence leaks that had cost other teams their lives. She suspected someone in her unit was working with enemy forces, selling information for profit. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This entire operation wasn't about capturing a high-value target. It was about silencing the one person who had gotten too close to uncovering a conspiracy that reached deep into their own ranks. Torres and his conspirators had set her up to die in what would look like a heroic sacrifice during a routine operation. As bullets continued to rain down on her position, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of staying put and dying like a good soldier, she was going to survive and expose the truth. She had evidence hidden back at base, documentation of the irregularities she had discovered, and now she had the proof of their betrayal in the form of this abandoned mission. Sarah began moving across the rooftop, using every piece of cover available as she worked her way toward the back of the building. Her radio continued to crackle with fake concern from Torres, urging her to hold position while making no effort to provide actual support. The hypocrisy was almost laughable, except that she was fighting for her life. As she reached the edge of the building, Sarah could hear footsteps on the stairs leading to the roof. The enemy forces were closing in on her position, guided by someone who knew exactly where to find her. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached the roof and discovered she was no longer in her original position. Sarah clipped her rappelling gear to the roof's edge and prepared to descend the back wall of the building. As she swung over the side, an explosion rocked the rooftop where she had been positioned just moments before. If she had stayed put as ordered, she would have been vaporized in the blast. The drop to the alley below was harrowing, but Sarah had trained for urban operations in hostile territory. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, and immediately moved toward the shadows between buildings. Her radio crackled one final time with Torres's voice, but now she could hear something different in his tone satisfaction. Viper 1 is down. I repeat, Viper 1 is down. Heavy casualties on the roof position. They thought she was dead, exactly as planned. Sarah turned off her radio and removed the battery, knowing that it could be used to track her location. She was now officially a ghost, presumed killed in action, but very much alive and very angry. The men who had betrayed her had no idea what was coming for them. As she moved through the narrow alleys of the city, Sarah began planning her next moves. She needed to get back to base without being detected, gather the evidence she had hidden, and find a way to expose the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. But first, she needed to disappear completely, to become the ghost that her call sign suggested. The sun was setting behind the compound as Sarah made her way toward the city's outskirts. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of vehicles and helicopters arriving at the scene. They would search the rubble for her body, and when they didn't find it, they would assume it had been completely destroyed in the blast. The perfect crime, except for one detail they hadn't counted on. Sarah Chun was far too stubborn to die quietly. Miles away from the compound, hidden in an abandoned building that she had scouted weeks earlier during mission planning, Sarah began to assess her situation. She had her rifle, her sidearm, limited ammunition, and a burning desire for justice. More importantly, she had survived when everyone expected her to die, and that gave her an advantage that her betrayers couldn't anticipate. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her own teammates, men she had trusted with her life countless times, had tried to murder her to protect their criminal activities. The brotherhood she had fought so hard to join had ultimately rejected her in the most brutal way possible. But grief would have to wait. Right now, she had work to do. Sarah checked her weapon and began planning her infiltration route back to the base. Torres and his conspirators thought they had eliminated their problem, but they had actually created something far more dangerous, a highly trained operator with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The game was about to change, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun was going to make sure that everyone involved in this betrayal would face the consequences of their actions. They had underestimated her once, and that mistake would be their last. Hashtag they left her to die. Part 2, 3 days had passed since the operation that was supposed to kill Lieutenant Sarah Chun, and the base was buzzing with talk of her heroic sacrifice. Captain Torres had delivered a moving speech about her dedication to the mission and how she had held her position until the very end, saving countless civilian lives. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she watched the ceremony from her hidden position in the ventilation system above the main briefing room. Getting back onto the base had been easier than she had anticipated. Years of studying security protocols and identifying weaknesses during her legitimate operations had prepared her for this moment. The perimeter guards were focused on keeping threats out, not preventing someone from getting back in. More importantly, since she was officially dead, no one was looking for her. Sarah had spent the past 72 hours moving through the base's underground maintenance tunnels and service areas that most personnel never bothered to explore. She had always been thorough in her reconnaissance, and that attention to detail was now keeping her alive. Food came from the late-night kitchen raids, water from maintenance taps, and shelter from unused storage areas that hadn't been checked in months. But survival wasn't her primary objective. Sarah was gathering intelligence on the conspiracy that had nearly killed her, and what she was discovering made her stomach turn. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined, involving not just Torres and his immediate team, but several high-ranking officers who had been selling classified information to enemy forces for over 2 years. During her covert observations, Sarah had overheard conversations that revealed the full scope of their operation. Equipment manifests were being falsified to hide weapons sales to insurgent groups. Mission intelligence was being leaked to ensure that certain operations would fail, eliminating witnesses and covering their tracks. Most horrifying of all, several previous casualties had been intentional eliminations of personnel who had gotten too close to the truth. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had died 6 months ago in what was reported as an IED explosion, but Sarah now knew that Torres had provided the insurgents with his exact patrol route. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez had been killed during a supposedly routine raid, but the enemy had been waiting for her team with detailed knowledge of their entry points. The list went on, each name representing a life lost to protect a criminal enterprise. Sarah had located her hidden evidence cache, a waterproof container buried beneath the base's communication tower that contained copies of all the documents she had gathered over months of investigation. Financial records, communication logs, mission reports with suspicious inconsistencies, and photographs of equipment that should have been destroyed but instead found its way into enemy hands. The evidence was damning, but Sarah knew that simply presenting it wouldn't be enough. Torres and his conspirators had powerful allies in the command structure, people who would discredit her claims and paint her as an unstable operator suffering from combat stress. She needed something more, something that would force an investigation that couldn't be buried or dismissed. As she reviewed the documents in her hiding place deep within the base's maintenance levels, Sarah began to piece together the full picture of how the conspiracy operated. Torres was the operational leader, coordinating with enemy contacts and managing the logistics of their criminal activities. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, was providing high-level protection and ensuring that investigations were buried before they could gain traction. Captain Lisa Martinez in intelligence was feeding classified information to Torres, while Sergeant First Class David Park in logistics was handling the equipment diversions. The pattern was clear once she knew what to look for. Every compromised operation had involved this core group, and every suspicious casualty had threatened their security in some way. Sarah realized that she hadn't been their first target, just their most recent one. The difference was that she had survived their attempt to silence her, giving her an opportunity that the others never had. On the fourth night, Sarah made her move. She had identified the location where the conspirators held their planning meetings, a supposedly abandoned bunker on the outskirts of the base that had been scheduled for demolition, but somehow never torn down. Torres and his team used it as their headquarters for planning operations that couldn't be discussed through official channels. Sarah positioned herself in the rafters of the bunker 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, using skills she had learned in urban warfare training to remain completely invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using her military training to spy on the very people who had trained her. When the conspirators arrived, their conversation confirmed every suspicion she had developed. "The Chin situation is handled," Torres was saying to Colonel Harrison as they settled around a makeshift table covered with maps and documents. Official reports list her as killed in action during the roof collapse. No body recovered, which actually works in our favor since there's nothing to examine. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. Good work. She was getting too close for comfort. Her questions about the Rodriguez incident were starting to attract attention from division. How did you manage the setup? Simple enough, Torres replied with a coldness that made Sarah's blood boil. I fed false intelligence about enemy positions to make sure she'd be exposed when the shooting started. Then, I had our contacts on the insurgent side focus their fire on her position while we staged our own firefight below. The roof charges were already in place when we arrived. Clean, professional, and completely deniable. Captain Martinez leaned forward, her voice tense with concern. Are we sure she didn't leave any evidence behind? Chun was thorough, maybe too thorough, if she documented her suspicions. I've had her quarters and workspace searched under the pretext of preparing memorial materials, Torres assured her. Nothing found. Even if she had suspicions, she didn't have proof. Our operational security has been perfect. Sarah almost laughed at his confidence. If their operational security had been perfect, she wouldn't be sitting in the rafters recording their confession with the digital recorder she had liberated from the intelligence office. Sometimes the most sophisticated conspiracies were undone by simple overconfidence. The meeting continued for another hour, during which Sarah learned details that made her earlier discoveries seem small by comparison. The group wasn't just selling equipment and intelligence. They were actively coordinating attacks on American forces to eliminate personnel who posed threats to their operation. They had been responsible for at least 12 deaths over the past 18 months, deaths that had been reported as combat casualties, but were actually targeted assassinations. Most shocking of all was the revelation that their network extended beyond this single base. They had connections with similar groups at 3 other installations, creating a web of corruption that spanned multiple countries and involved dozens of personnel. The profits from their activities were being laundered through a complex series of overseas accounts and shell companies. As the meeting began to wind down, Torres made an announcement that chilled Sarah to the bone. Intelligence indicates that Division is planning to send an investigative team next month to review our recent casualty reports. We need to eliminate any remaining loose ends before they arrive. What kind of loose ends? Sergeant Park asked nervously. Anyone who might have had contact with Chun regarding her suspicions. Lieutenant Thompson, in communications, mentioned that she had been asking questions about encrypted message traffic. Staff Sergeant Williams in the motor pool said she was examining maintenance records for vehicles that were supposed to have been destroyed. They both need to have accidents. Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. Make it look realistic. Combat stress casualties, vehicle accidents, whatever works. We've come too far to let a few loose ends bring us down now. Sarah felt sick as she realized that her investigation hadn't just put her own life at risk. It had also endangered others who had simply tried to help her. Thompson and Williams were good soldiers who had answered her questions without realizing they were putting themselves in danger. Now they were marked for death because of her curiosity. But the conversation also revealed something else. The conspirators were feeling pressure from higher authority. If Division was sending investigators, it meant that someone above Colonel Harrison had noticed irregularities that couldn't be ignored. Sarah's investigation might have been more successful than she realized, creating enough documentation in official channels to trigger a response from headquarters. After the conspirators left the bunker, Sarah remained in the rafters for another hour to ensure they were really gone. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She now had recorded evidence of their crimes, but she also knew that they planned to kill at least 2 more people in the coming days. Simply waiting for the Division investigators might save her, but it would condemn Thompson and Williams to death. Sarah made a decision that aligned with everything she had sworn to protect when she became SEAL. She was going to stop the conspiracy before it could claim any more victims, even if it meant revealing herself and putting her own life at risk. The evidence she had gathered would ensure that justice was served, but only if she could get it into the right hands before Torres and his team eliminated the remaining witnesses. As she climbed down from the rafters, Sarah began planning the most important operation of her career. She had been trained to complete impossible missions behind enemy lines, but this time the enemy was wearing the same uniform she wore. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure would mean not just her own death, but the continued murders of innocent people by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. The next phase of her war was about to begin, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun was ready to fight for the honor that Torres and his conspirators had betrayed. They thought they had killed her, but they had actually created something far more dangerous. A ghost with a mission and nothing left to lose. Hashtag, they left her to die. Part 3, Lieutenant Thompson never saw it coming. Sarah watched from the shadows as the young communications officer walked his usual route to the motor pool, completely unaware that Captain Torres was following him from a distance. The timing was perfect from Torres's perspective, an isolated stretch of road between buildings, no witnesses, and an opportunity to stage what would look like a tragic accident. But Sarah had anticipated this moment. For the past 24 hours, she had been shadowing both Thompson and Williams, knowing that Torres would move quickly to eliminate them before the division investigators arrived. She had positioned herself along Thompson's route, waiting for the inevitable attack, while struggling with the knowledge that revealing herself would expose her own survival to the conspiracy. Torres moved with practiced efficiency, pulling alongside Thompson in a military vehicle and offering him a ride. Sarah could see Thompson's grateful smile as he climbed into the passenger seat, having no idea that he was sitting next to his killer. The vehicle began moving toward a section of the base where construction work provided perfect cover for an accident. Sarah had seconds to make a decision that would change everything. She could let Thompson die and preserve her covert advantage, potentially saving more lives in the long run. Or she could blow her cover to save one man and risk everything she had worked for. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Her training and her conscience demanded action. Moving with the speed and precision that had earned her the call sign Viper, Sarah intercepted the vehicle at the construction zone. She had positioned herself behind a concrete barrier, invisible until the moment she stepped into the road with her rifle raised and aimed directly at Torres through the windshield. "Stop the vehicle now," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and emerged stronger. Torres's face went white as he saw her. The man who had orchestrated her supposed death was now staring at a ghost, and Sarah could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. Thompson looked between them, slowly beginning to understand that something was very wrong with this situation. "Chun, but we saw the explosion," Torres stammered, his hand moving slowly toward his sidearm. "Don't even think about it," Sarah warned, her rifle never wavering from its target. "Thompson, get out of the vehicle and move away. Now." The young lieutenant complied immediately, recognizing the tone of someone who would not be disobeyed. He moved to safety behind Sarah's position, his mind clearly racing to process what he was witnessing. Sarah kept her attention focused on Torres, watching for any sign that he might try something desperate. "Ow!" Torres asked, genuine curiosity mixing with his obvious fear. The roof was completely destroyed. No one could have survived that blast. "You forgot the most important rule of our training," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Always have an exit strategy. While you were busy planning my murder, I was planning my survival." The standoff continued for several tense seconds before Sarah made her next move. "Thompson, use your radio to contact base security. Tell them you need immediate assistance at grid coordinates 347 to 821. Tell them Captain Torres just attempted to murder you and that you're being protected by Lieutenant Chun." Thompson hesitated, clearly confused by the surreal nature of the situation. "Ma'am, I don't understand. The captain said you were killed in action 3 days ago. And why would he want to hurt me?" "Because you helped me investigate irregularities in communication logs," Sarah explained without taking her eyes off Torres. "You provided me with evidence that this conspiracy has been selling classified information to enemy forces." Torres and his team decided that anyone with knowledge of their activities needed to disappear. The pieces began falling into place for Thompson, and Sarah could see understanding dawn on his face. "The questions you asked about encrypted traffic patterns, you suspected someone was leaking information." "I didn't suspect it," Sarah corrected. "I proved it. Torres and his conspirators have been responsible for at least 12 deaths of American personnel, including mine, which obviously didn't work out as planned." Torres, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Chun. This goes far beyond anything you could understand. There are people involved who can make you disappear permanently, along with anyone who tries to help you." "Is that a threat?" Sarah asked, her finger moving to her rifle's trigger. "It's a fact," Torres replied with renewed confidence. "You think you're protecting Thompson, but you've just signed his death warrant. And yours again. This time we'll make sure the job gets finished." Sarah was about to respond when the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Multiple engines, moving fast and from different directions. She had hoped that Thompson's radio call would bring help, but as the first vehicle came into view, she realized that her situation had just become much more complicated. The lead vehicle bore the markings of base security, but the second and third vehicles belonged to Colonel Harrison and Captain Martinez. The entire conspiracy was converging on her location, and Sarah suddenly understood that Torres had been stalling, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. "Thompson," she said urgently, "when I tell you to run, you head for the construction trailer behind us and barricade yourself inside. Don't come out until you hear from legitimate division personnel, not anyone from this base." "What about you?" Thompson asked, his training beginning to override his confusion. "I'm about to remind these traitors why they should have made sure I was actually dead before they started celebrating." The vehicles formed a loose semicircle around Sarah's position, effectively trapping her and Thompson behind the concrete barriers. Sarah counted at least 8 personnel emerging from the vehicles, all of them part of Torres's conspiracy network. The odds were overwhelming, but Sarah had faced worse situations in hostile territory. Colonel Harrison approached the barriers with his hands visible, projecting an image of reasoned authority. "Lieutenant Shun, I'm very glad to see you alive. We've been searching for you since the incident. You've obviously been through a traumatic experience, and we need to get you medical attention immediately." Sarah almost laughed at his performance. "Save it, Colonel. I was in your little bunker meeting 2 nights ago. I heard everything about your operation, including your plans to murder Thompson and Williams. I have recordings of your entire confession." Harrison's mask slipped momentarily, revealing the cold calculation beneath his facade. "I think combat stress has affected your judgment, Lieutenant. You're making serious accusations against your commanding officers based on what you believe you heard. We need to get you proper psychiatric evaluation." "The only thing I need," Sarah replied, "is for you and your conspirators to surrender your weapons and submit to arrest. I have evidence of your criminal activities, and division investigators are already en route to this base." That last part was a bluff, but Sarah could see it hit home. Harrison and Torres exchanged glances, and she could practically see them calculating their options. They were cornered, and cornered criminals were always the most dangerous. "Thompson," Harrison called out, "you need to understand that Lieutenant Shun has been under enormous stress. She's clearly suffering from paranoid delusions brought on by her traumatic experience. For your own safety, you need to move away from her and let us provide appropriate medical care." But Thompson had heard enough to understand the truth of the situation. "Sir, with all due respect, if Lieutenant Shun is delusional, why did Captain Torres just try to drive me to an isolated location? And why are all of you here instead of base security?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could see Harrison's patience beginning to wear thin. The time for pretense was rapidly running out, and she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she and Thompson survived this encounter. Sarah made a quick tactical assessment of her situation. 8 hostile personnel in a semicircle formation, limited cover, 1 civilian to protect, and finite ammunition. The odds were terrible, but she had been in worse situations during her deployments. The difference was that this time, she was fighting people who knew her tactics and capabilities. "Last chance," she called out to the conspirators. "Surrender now, and I'll ensure that you receive fair treatment during your court-martial. Continue this path, and I'll defend myself and Lieutenant Thompson with all necessary force." Harrison's response was to signal his personnel to spread out and take positions behind their vehicles. The diplomacy phase was over, and Sarah prepared herself for the firefight of her life. She had promised herself that Torres and his conspirators would face justice for their crimes, and she intended to keep that promise no matter the cost. As the first shots rang out across the construction zone, Sarah thought about all the fellow servicemen and women who had died because of these traitors. Today, their deaths would finally be avenged, and the conspiracy that had corrupted her unit would be exposed for the world to see. #They left her to die. Part 4. The first bullet shattered the concrete barrier just inches from Sarah's head, sending fragments of debris across her face. She responded instantly, her rifle barking as she put down precise fire that forced the conspirators to seek better cover. Years of combat experience took over, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun became the weapon that her training had forged her to be. "Thompson, stay down and keep moving toward that trailer," she shouted over the gunfire, never taking her eyes off the tactical situation developing around them. 8 hostiles with superior positioning and firepower But they had made one critical mistake. They were fighting on terrain that Sarah had studied and prepared for over the past several days. Captain Torres tried to flank her position from the left, moving between construction equipment with the confidence of someone who had trained alongside his target. But Sarah had anticipated this move, having observed his tactical preferences during dozens of legitimate operations. She waited until he committed to his approach, then put 2 rounds center mass that dropped him behind a bulldozer. "Torres is down," she called out, as much for the psychological effect as for tactical communication. "Who's next?" The answer came in the form of concentrated fire from 3 directions, forcing Sarah to abandon her primary position and move deeper into the construction zone. She had studied this area extensively, noting every piece of cover, every sight line, and every potential escape route. Her preparation was now paying dividends as she moved through the maze of equipment and materials with the fluid grace of a predator. Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the firefight, attempting to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "Cease fire. We need her alive to find out what evidence she's gathered." But the adrenaline of combat had taken over, and several of his conspirators continued shooting. Sarah could hear Harrison cursing as his carefully planned operation descended into chaos. The colonel had wanted to stage a rescue scenario where they eliminated both Sarah and Thompson while appearing to be heroes responding to a crisis. Instead, he was watching his entire network get exposed in a public firefight. Sarah reached the construction trailer and quickly assessed its defensive potential. Thick walls, limited entry points, and elevated position that would give her superior fields of fire. She had Thompson barricade himself inside, while she took up a position that allowed her to cover the approaches from multiple angles. "This is your last chance to surrender," she called out to the remaining conspirators. "I have evidence of your activities already secured off base. Killing me won't protect you anymore." That was another bluff, but it served its purpose. Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into the movements of Harrison's remaining personnel. They had signed up for profitable criminal activity, not a shooting war with a highly trained special operations soldier who seemed to know their every move. Captain Martinez made the mistake of trying to approach the trailer from the blind side, apparently unaware that Sarah had positioned herself to cover that exact route. The intelligence officer had spent her career behind a desk, analyzing reports and managing communications. She had no experience with actual combat, and it showed in her clumsy approach through the construction materials. Sarah's shot was precise and surgical, wounding Martinez in the leg and sending her sprawling behind a pile of steel beams. The captain's screams of pain filled the air, providing a stark reminder to the other conspirators about the reality of their situation. "Martinez needs medical attention," Harrison shouted. "Jen, this has gone far enough. People are going to die. People have already died." Sarah responded, her anger finally breaking through her tactical composure. 12 of our own people, murdered to protect your profit margins. Lieutenant Webb, Sergeant Rodriguez, all the others you betrayed and killed." The emotion in her voice carried across the construction zone, and Sarah could see its effect on the remaining conspirators. Some of them might not have known the full scope of the murders that had been committed in their name. The conspiracy had clearly operated on a need-to-know basis, with Harrison and Torres managing the most violent aspects of their criminal enterprise. Sergeant Park, the logistics specialist who had been managing equipment diversions, suddenly stood up from behind his vehicle with his hands raised. "I surrender. I didn't know about any killings. I just processed paperwork." Harrison's shot took Park in the back before he could take 3 steps towards Sarah's position. The colonel's message was clear: no surrenders, no witnesses, no exceptions. The conspiracy would survive by eliminating everyone who could threaten it, including their own members who showed weakness. The cold-blooded murder of his own subordinate seemed to galvanize the remaining conspirators. They realized that Harrison would sacrifice anyone to protect himself, and their own survival now depended on defeating Sarah before she could expose their activities. The firefight intensified as desperation replaced calculation. Sarah found herself facing a coordinated assault from 5 remaining hostiles, including Harrison himself. They advanced on her position using proper tactical formations, proof that whatever else they might be, they were still professionally trained soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was facing the same tactics she had been taught, executed by the same people who had trained her. But Sarah had advantages that her opponents lacked. She knew their individual strengths and weaknesses from years of working alongside them. She understood their psychological profiles and could predict their tactical decisions. Most importantly, she was fighting for justice and survival while they were fighting to protect their crimes. The battle reached its climax as Harrison and his two remaining allies made a final push toward the trailer. Sarah had been conserving her ammunition for this moment, and her shots were devastating in their accuracy. One conspirator went down immediately, while the second was wounded but continued advancing. Harrison himself proved more challenging, using his experience and training to present a minimal target while closing the distance. Sarah found herself in a close-quarters engagement with her former commanding officer, a man who had once recommended her for promotion and commended her courage under fire. The fight was brutal and personal, each combatant using every skill they had learned during decades of military service. Harrison was larger and stronger, but Sarah was faster and more motivated. Where her rifle ran empty, she transitioned to her sidearm. When his shots forced her into close combat, she used the hand-to-hand techniques that had been drilled into her since basic training. In the end, it was Harrison's arrogance that proved his downfall. He had always underestimated Sarah, seeing her as a diversity hire rather than a legitimate operator. That blind spot cost him the split-second advantage he needed, and Sarah's final shot ended the conspiracy's leadership permanently. As silence fell across the construction zone, Sarah took stock of the carnage around her. 6 bodies lay scattered among the equipment and materials, testament to the violence that corruption could spawn when cornered. Thompson emerged from the trailer, his face pale, but his resolve intact. "It's over," Sarah said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the broader network that Harrison had mentioned still existed. Other bases, other conspirators, other innocents who would die if the corruption wasn't completely exposed. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, and Sarah recognized the distinctive noise of military aircraft approaching fast. Either more conspirators were arriving to finish the job, or legitimate authority was finally responding to the crisis. Given everything she had been through, Sarah prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. As the helicopters circled overhead, Sarah could see official division markings on their hulls. Real investigators, not more conspirators. Her gamble had paid off. The evidence she had gathered and transmitted to higher authority had triggered a response that arrived just in time to witness the final battle. Thompson stood beside her as the helicopters landed, both of them survivors of a conspiracy that had claimed too many lives. Sarah knew that the fight was far from over. There would be investigations, court-martials, and efforts to discredit her testimony. But the truth was finally going to come out, and justice would be served for all the people who had died protecting secrets that should never have been kept. Hashtag, they left her to die. Part 5. 6 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Chin stood before a packed courtroom in Washington, D.C., as the final verdicts were read in what had become the largest military corruption trial in modern history. The woman who had been left to die by her own teammates was now the star witness whose testimony had exposed a criminal network that spanned 4 countries and 17 military installations. The investigation that followed the firefight at the construction zone had revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than even Sarah had imagined. Harrison's network had been operating for over 3 years, responsible for at least 37 deaths of American military personnel who had been eliminated to protect the group's criminal activities. The financial scope was staggering: over $50 million in stolen equipment, sold intelligence, and blood money. In the matter of the United States versus Colonel James Harrison, the defendant having been found guilty of treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and conspiracy to provide aid to enemy forces, this court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Sarah felt a wave of satisfaction as the judge pronounced Harrison's sentence. The man who had orchestrated her attempted murder was now facing the consequences of his betrayal. But the victory was bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge of all the lives that could have been saved if someone had uncovered the conspiracy earlier. Captain Martinez had received 25 years for her role in providing classified intelligence to enemy forces. The 3 surviving members of Torres's team had received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement in the murders. Most importantly, The investigation had uncovered and dismantled similar networks at the other compromised installations. Lieutenant Thompson, who had become an unlikely ally during those terrifying days, now served as Sarah's advocate and friend. His testimony about the events at the construction zone had been crucial in establishing the timeline and proving that Sarah had acted in self-defense. The young communications officer had also provided technical expertise that helped investigators trace the digital communications between the conspirators and their foreign contacts. "Ma'am, there's someone here who wants to meet you," Thompson said, approaching Sarah as the courtroom began to empty. Behind him walked a woman in the uniform of a Navy admiral, someone Sarah recognized from news broadcasts but had never expected to meet personally. Admiral Patricia Sullivan extended her hand with a warm smile. "Lieutenant Chun, I've been looking forward to this conversation for months. I'm Admiral Sullivan, Director of Naval Special Warfare. I have a proposition that I think might interest you." They moved to a private conference room where Admiral Sullivan outlined an offer that Sarah never could have anticipated. "We're establishing a new unit within Naval Special Warfare, focused specifically on investigating corruption and criminal activity within our own ranks. The events you uncovered have made it clear that we need people with your unique combination of operational skills and investigative instincts." Sarah listened with growing interest as the Admiral described the proposed unit. It would have broad authority to investigate suspected criminal activity across all military branches, with direct reporting to the highest levels of command. The personnel would be carefully selected special operations veterans with proven integrity and the skills necessary to operate against sophisticated criminal networks. "We need someone to lead this unit," Admiral Sullivan continued. "Someone who has demonstrated the courage to stand up to corruption even when it meant risking everything. Someone who has the operational experience to take on criminal networks that are as well-trained and equipped as any enemy we've faced in conventional warfare." The offer was simultaneously appealing and daunting. Sarah would be promoted to lieutenant commander and given resources that would allow her to prevent the kind of betrayal she had experienced. But it would also mean making enemies within her own military, people who saw oversight and accountability as threats to their power. "I'll need to think about it," Sarah replied, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. "Take all the time you need," Admiral Sullivan said. "But I hope you'll consider that this is an opportunity to honor the memory of all the people who died because of Harrison's conspiracy. Lieutenant Webb, Sergeant Rodriguez, and all the others deserve to know that their deaths led to meaningful change." That evening, Sarah found herself at Arlington National Cemetery, standing before the graves of Marcus Webb and Jennifer Rodriguez. The two soldiers had been among Harrison's earliest victims, killed when they began asking questions about irregularities in mission planning and equipment allocation. Their deaths had been reported as combat casualties, heroes who died serving their country, when in reality they had been murdered by the very people they trusted to protect them. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," Sarah whispered to the headstones. "But I promise that what happened to you will never happen to anyone else if I can prevent it." As she stood in the gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a conventional special operations soldier, focused on completing missions and eliminating external threats. The betrayal by her own teammates had transformed her into something different, someone who understood that the greatest threats to military personnel sometimes came from within their own ranks. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Thompson. "Have you made your decision about Admiral Sullivan's offer? For what it's worth, I think you'd be amazing at it." Sarah smiled at his support. Thompson had become more than just a witness to her ordeal. He had become a true friend and ally. His technical expertise with communication systems had already proven invaluable during the investigation, and Admiral Sullivan had hinted that he might be offered a position in the new unit as well. The next morning, Sarah returned to Admiral Sullivan's office with her decision. "I accept your offer, ma'am, but I have some conditions." "I am listening." "First, I want Lieutenant Thompson as my second in command. He's proven his integrity and his skills, and I trust him completely. Second, I want full access to personnel files and mission records going back at least 5 years. There may be other networks we haven't discovered yet. Third, I want the authority to investigate anyone, regardless of rank or position, if evidence suggests criminal activity." Admiral Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Those are reasonable requests, and I can authorize all of them. When can you start?" "Immediately," Sarah replied without hesitation. The new unit was designated as the Special Operations Integrity Division, with Sarah as its commanding officer and Thompson as her deputy. Their first case involved investigating suspicious casualties at a base in Afghanistan, where 3 separate incidents had claimed the lives of personnel who had been asking questions about missing equipment. As Sarah reviewed the case files in her new office, she felt a sense of purpose that she had never experienced before. She was no longer just a soldier following orders. She was a guardian protecting the people who served alongside her. The betrayal that had nearly cost her life had ultimately led her to a mission that aligned perfectly with her values and skills. Thompson knocked on her door and entered with a cup of coffee and a stack of new case files. "Good morning, Commander. We've got reports of suspicious activity at 3 more installations. Looks like we're going to be busy." Sarah accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "That's exactly what I was hoping for. Let's get started." As she opened the first case file, Sarah thought about the conversation she had overheard in Harrison's bunker when he had boasted about the extent of their criminal network. He had been right about one thing: the corruption had spread far beyond what anyone had imagined. But he had also been wrong about something crucial. He had assumed that no one would have the courage to stand up to them. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had proven him wrong about that, and now she was going to spend her career making sure that other corrupt networks would face the same fate. They had left her to die, but she had returned as something far more dangerous than they could have imagined: a hunter of those who betrayed the uniform they wore. The war against internal corruption was just beginning, and Sarah was ready to lead the charge. Every soldier who served honorably deserved to know that someone was watching their back, protecting them from the enemies within their own ranks. That was her mission now, and she would pursue it with the same dedication and skill that had made her one of the Navy's most effective special operations soldiers. Outside her window, the American flag flew at full staff, a symbol of the values that Harrison and his conspirators had betrayed. Sarah saluted the flag and then turned back to her work, ready to ensure that those values would be protected by someone who understood the true cost of betrayal and the absolute necessity of justice.